My name is Joe Allen. As Patrick mentioned, I'm a part of the leadership team of the center, also a member of the psychology department here at UVA. And it's my pleasure to introduce this panel today. If you do a little word association test just to yourselves, and I say teens, peers, and then leave a blank, what comes to mind? I think the kinds of things, my experience, people associate are trouble, pressure, delinquency, drugs, gangs, all sorts of negative kinds of outcomes. And that's really important, and there are a lot of people, and myself included, and these panelists included, who've studied these over the years. But we're realizing that there's another side, and there's a positive side to peer influences in adolescence, and it's a side that we have to take into account. The best evidence we have says that adolescents currently, in terms of their engaged interactions each week, spend about 16 hours with adults in engaged interactions, sort of back and forth, and about 60 with their peers. That's probably about exactly the opposite of what the ratio was 100 years ago, but it seems like it's here to stay. So if we're talking about how to socialize our adolescents, we have to recognize they are in fact being socialized by their peers. So we are very lucky to have 4 panelists here today who've begun to think about that socialization process and have begun to really make what I think is a revolutionary change from going and thinking about negative ways that peers socialize one another, thinking about some positive ways they do it, and even to beginning to think about how we might begin to enhance those positive approaches. From mechanisms to how we measure things to some early thinking about intervention. So it's a brand new area. It's an area that these panelists are pioneering in, and I'm not going to say anymore because I want to leave them as much time as possible to talk about this. So our first talk today is by Mitchell Prinstein. Comes to us from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and we don't hold that against him, where he's the Bowman and Gordon Gray Distinguished Term Professor of Psychology there. He's also the Director of Clinical Psychology. Mitch has numerous awards and honors to his name. He received the American Psychological Association Early Career Award for outstanding contributions to the field of clinical psychology. He's a current editor of the Journal of Clinical Child and Adolescent Psychology, and he's going to talk today on mechanisms of peer influence, leveraging our knowledge of adolescent socialization processes to promote effective development.
Hello, thank you. I'm just waiting. See how this works. Aha. How do we go back? The red button, that is what the red button is for. All right, thank you very much. I am honored and humbled to be here, and very excited to hear the work that everybody is engaged in. I am coming from a developmental psychopathology perspective, so I've spent a lot of time and energy thinking about ways to pull kids back from the tail of a continuum that really represents different degrees of risk for psychopathology and negative outcomes. It's a pleasure to be able to think a little bit about ways to enhance kids' development within this different distribution of developing positive outcomes and thinking about acquisition of skills and competence and a variety of other C's that we've heard about today. My perception of the field in the area of peer influence, however, hasn't done enough to really think about the ways that peers might positively influence one another. In fact, I would say that most of the research that's been done in trying to understand peer influence has focused predominantly on risk outcomes. There's been substantial research demonstrating that peers can be quite influential in the development of adolescents, externalizing symptoms, substance use. There's been some work that's beginning to understand peer influence towards sexual risk behaviors, also some internalizing symptoms like depression. Recently, there's been work trying to understand peer influences towards other health risk behaviors, for instance, weight management behaviors, also non-suicidal self-injury, and all the way down on the bottom there in the amount of research, in an area of research that I think is just beginning and needs far more attention is understanding how it is that peers might influence each other towards pro-social and adaptive outcomes. Generally, what we know from the research that's been done in understanding how peer influence works has revealed, and this has remarkably been shown in many, many different literatures, not just in the psychological literature, but we have very strong associations between what it is that peers do and what it is that adolescents themselves do. And this has been described a long time ago as perhaps being due to two different types of processes. One is that adolescents actually will go seek out opportunities to befriend and affiliate with others who already have similar values and attitudes and engage in similar behaviors. The second, of course, is the idea that affiliation with those teens will increase adolescents' own engagement in those behaviors of which they similarly had previously engaged in adolescence with. Excuse me. So for us to understand how it is that we can think about positive peer influences, we really do want to understand both the selection and the socialization processes. So what I'd like to think about for a little bit in the time that I have today is ways that we can think about what we know from peer influence research that has been done predominantly on understanding negative peer influences, and think about how we can turn that towards the use of adaptive peer influences. So briefly, I'd like to mention a little bit about who the different sources of peer influence may be, and then talk a bit more on the mechanisms of peer influence and how we might be able to exploit those in a benevolent fashion towards good. Well, a lot of research and a lot of ways that we think about peer influence usually conceptualizes a socializing agent as being an adolescent's best friend. And indeed, there is a substantial amount of research suggesting that adolescents can be influenced by their very best friends. But it's important to recognize that peer influencers can be many different peers within somebody's environment. And there's now a growing literature that's really showing that there are very unique ways in which each different peer influence may exist within an adolescent's own context. For instance, in addition to understanding very best friends, it's the exception that a best friend dyad occurs in isolation. Usually a friendship occurs within a larger group of friends or within a peer clique. But adolescents, of course, are also engaged in romantic partnerships, and that's a very different kind of relationship that emerging evidence suggests can also be highly influential. It seems that many youth are very interested in understanding what it is that will make them popular. And whatever the popular kids may be doing becomes a very influential source of information for adolescents. Of course, there are different ways that adolescents are affiliated with other reputation-based groups like crowds. There are peer groups that we put kids in structurally, whether it be a classroom setting or a sports team or on when understanding groups of kids that have been put together for an intervention. We could talk about prison inmates or group therapy contexts. And all of these are different sources in which peers can be highly influential. And of course, there's peers depicted in the media. What we know very little about is how we can change things based on these peer selection effects. I think there's substantial anecdotal evidence to suggest that telling an adolescent who they should be friends with doesn't work very well. So trying to reduce negative peer influence or promote positive influence by picking their friends and their romantic partners for them, not likely to work very well. But as we can see, there might be some of these other peer contexts that might be areas that we can think about a little bit more, especially for those structural types of peer influences that we're in more control of setting up. Also, I think what's an important area for us to move forward in thinking about is how is it that adolescents who are constantly bombarded with messages from all of these different peer contexts, how do they reconcile the conflicting messages? If their romantic partner suggests that they engage in behavior X, but their best friend suggests they behave and engage behavior Y, then how is it that adolescents decide which of these many peer influences to listen to and who is going to ultimately be most influential? What I'd like to spend more time talking about, though, today is the idea of how does peer influence work? Because although we've had hundreds of studies helping us to understand the many behaviors that are subject to peer influence and the many contexts that may be influential, we know relatively little about why our kids are influenced by peers. And I'm not going to talk about some of these, but just to briefly mention, it doesn't seem that kids are overtly pressured as much as the popular media would suggest. Instead, we see that there are a variety of more implicit processes that occur that seem to be the ways in which peers may be guided, adolescents may be guided by their peers' behavior. In particular, I'd like to talk a little bit about the idea of social norms and the sense that adolescents might engage in behaviors that match their perception of social norms, because in doing so, they feel that it will help them to align with somebody that they idealize, someone that they would like to be affiliated with or associated with, and thus they're going to feel better about themselves. So these social norms theories are a way towards adolescents feeling good ultimately about their identity, which, as we know, is a huge task for this developmental period. So previously I mentioned that peers' behaviors are likely to lead to increases in youth's own behaviors or attitudes. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. So of course, what's really happening is that peers may engage in specific behaviors. Adolescents then perceive that their peers are engaging in those behaviors. And then it's those perceptions that are the more proximal predictor of what it is that adolescents do. Well, that offers us an intervention target. How is it that we can more accurately help adolescents to perceive or construct a notion of the social norms that explain what it is they think their peers are doing, whether that be the popular peers, what they think their best friends might endorse attitudinally or behaviorally? Well, there are a variety of different fields. Social psychology in particular has given us a lot of information to show us that when we come up with a sense of what we think is normative, when we try and estimate these public norms, we do a really bad job of it. There are a variety of different reasons why it is that we are erroneous in our estimations of other people's behavior. Some of the kids that are having the hardest time doing this are those who have a past history of being aggressive or rejected, and they happen to be at the greatest risk of engaging in some of these negative health outcomes. The good news then for us is that some of the kids that we're hoping, the bad news for us is that these might be the kids that we're most hoping to help them develop more positive attributes, but they happen to do particularly poorly at estimating the behaviors of others. Of course, this notion has led to intervention models. This might be a little bit difficult to see, but this is a college campus intervention that was used in order to curb drinking among college students. Here you can see a variety of different pictures of adolescents, male and female, and then some who appear to be recently ill from drinking. At the bottom it says something about how the vast majority of kids don't actually drink very much when they go out on the weekends. And then on the bottom it says, congratulations and welcome to the majority. This is a social norming intervention, clearly trying to make it clear that if you thought that most kids in college go out and drink a lot, you're wrong. Here's the right information, and hopefully you'll want to do what the majority is doing. Other social norms interventions will specifically address the attitudes underlying behaviors. So rather than saying that there are lots of people drinking or not, suggesting that some people drink and they don't actually want to be doing so, or they secretly disapprove of drinking very much. One of these interventions would look like this. 5 drinks in a single night is crazy. Most of us realize this and don't party insanely. And then again, it says, congratulations and welcome to the majority. Again, the idea that a social norming intervention that helps people to understand that most people share in the attitudes of not wanting to engage in risky behavior might convince kids themselves to behave more appropriately. These social norming interventions don't work very, very well, however, and one reason why is because in adolescence, and if you show these, by the way, to adolescents, they'll often laugh and let you know that this means nothing to me. This is clearly adults trying to tell me what to do. This is not the reference group that means something to me. I will show you just briefly a little bit of data that we've collected to demonstrate that this same idea might be useful in thinking about adolescent social norm construction and also help us to think about the development of positive behaviors. Specifically, in a sample of adolescents, we asked kids to tell us about the social norms of groups that they recognize as being the salient social norming groups. And if you've been to high school, you probably know those groups have names. Names like the populars, the jocks, the burnouts, and the academically oriented groups, which are sometimes called the nerds or the geeks. These are groups that actually are out there. Adolescents think about their peer relations and about their norms using these terms. This is the way that adolescents think about peer influence, so it's the way that we should study peer influence. If you ask, sorry, let me go back there for a second and just briefly mention that what I'll show you here very briefly is what is it that people outside of each of these groups think that group members might do? So for instance, what does a non-popular think is the normative behavior of a popular kid? Also, I'll then show you what is it that popular kids think is the most typical behavior of their fellow members of the popular group. And then lastly, what is it that we find out are the behaviors of those people who are in those stereotyped positions of being in these extreme groups? Well, it's probably no surprise that people think that, that non-jocks and non-populars think that jocks and populars engage in a lot of sexual intercourse. This is a Likert scale indicating the number of sexual partners. One doesn't mean one partner, it's actually just on a Likert scale. People think that academically oriented teens are not likely to have sexual intercourse partners. If you ask people within these groups who should have a more accurate way of estimating social norms, because they're actually in the groups we're asking them to tell us about, then jocks and populars say, well, we probably don't have as many sexual intercourse partners as people think, but I believe that people in my group, in fact, do have many sexual intercourse partners. But when we look at data indicating how many sexual intercourse partners people within these groups actually report that they've had, we find that in many cases, the norms that people are using are poorly constructed, suggesting that, in fact, people tend to overestimate the behavior. This is also the case when we look at other kinds of behaviors we'd like to prevent, for instance, cigarette use. But if we look at this towards behaviors that we'd like to encourage, we find here that there are no differences between at least 3 of these groups. The jocks do, in fact, exercise as much as people think they do, probably because that exercise is done visibly within the school context, and those are clearly noted. You can see them doing it. But in fact, the other 3 groups engage in equal amounts of exercise, as indicated by the 3 bright green bars here, indicating that, in fact, we also underestimate how much it is that people within the peer network might engage in these positive behaviors. We can see the same thing in terms of studying. Believe it or not, the nerds don't study any more than the people in the other groups, although people do think that they engage in a lot more. So we might want to think about the idea of how we can construct social norms that will help to promote positive development. Let me end very briefly by just mentioning one other area that I don't think has gotten very much attention at all, but in fact might be a very sneaky way that we can think about how to use peer influence for good rather than evil. And I'll just briefly mention that the way that we've been studying peer influence in our lab is to have adolescents participate in an internet chat room where they think they're interacting with 3 members of their grade who are in the same gender and, of course, the same grade. We then ask adolescents to answer a variety of questions, and before they're able to give their response, we show them what other people in their school have said. Now, we give them the same questions and the same responses across several experimental conditions, and in all of these experimental conditions, the chat room is fake. So they're actually just interacting with computerized entities that we've developed. The only information we give them to help them identify who these people may be that they're interacting with is by giving the first name and the last initial of the people who are in their grade. And we manipulate only this information that I've just put up here so we can communicate whether it is that they're in a chat room with the most popular kids in their grade or with the least popular kids in their grade. And we generally find that that's a very, very effective manipulation. Kids do very much believe that they are in a chat room with real people, and they very much feel that those people are, in fact, the very, very popular or the very, very unpopular kids. And then we ask them to answer some questions that they've answered previously. We then take out those pretest responses. They see how it is that other kids respond, and then they respond themselves. Well, in very recent data that we've just finished collecting some of our data for about 150 kids from a very ethnically diverse, low SES status community, we have found that, in fact, sure, if you ask kids to listen to the behavior, to be witness to the social norms that are being communicated by popular kids, that's more likely to influence adolescents to say that they, too, would engage in dangerous behaviors. And that was the design in this particular study. We can see a little bit of an effect suggesting that if you are an unpopular kid, if you are in a chat room where you believe you're hearing unpopular kids say that they would do deviant things, you're less likely to want to engage in those behaviors. But when we look at the status of our kids themselves, when we look at whether the kids sitting in the chat room are real live participants themselves are popular, average, or unpopular, we find actually quite a dramatic effect. So what I'll show you here just very briefly is that particularly for those kids who are very unpopular, these are the kids we most want to help them develop pro-social skills. even though they saw the exact same responses, the same social norms were communicated across both conditions of our experiment. If they thought the popular kids were saying that it's good to do deviant acts to engage in health risk behaviors, they went right ahead and conformed, as you can see with the blue bar on the left-hand side of the screen. But when those exact same norms were communicated by people that they thought were the least popular kids in their school, not only did they not conform, which would be a 0 on the standardized scale, but they very much tried to distance themselves from those social norms by saying the exact opposite. And we had these unpopular kids saying that they endorsed very pro-social adaptive things in these hypothetical situations that we conveyed. Anti-conformity is not studied very often, but it's an interesting way to think about peer influence because it's conformity when kids don't realize they're conforming. They think they're doing the opposite of what's been told to them, but that's still conformity. So, sorry, I'm a little bit over. I'll just briefly say that I do think this is a terrific area to explore further to understand how peer influence can be used for good and what positive peer influences naturally occur. And if we'd like to encourage that a little bit further, we might want to think about social norm messaging and the implications of anti-conformity. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mitch. Next up, we have Brad Brown, who is the professor of human development and former chair of the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Brad's the former editor of the Journal of Research on Adolescence. He's co-editor of 3 books. He served as a consultant for the National Science Foundation, the Carnegie Council on Adolescent Development, the National Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy, among others. He's also in the midst of raising 3 sons. He's going to talk today on promoting AAA peer influences, the case of teen driving.
Thanks, Joe. So I got on the airplane yesterday, settled in my seat. There's something weird. And I took my hand and I put it right at where my knee was, and I was able to extend it all the way before hitting the seat in front of me. I didn't know they made airplane seats with that much legroom. Now, I imagine some of you are feeling, as I did, very perplexed there at the title, Promoting Peer Influences. That sounds sort of like a non sequitur. Why would we promote something that, as Mitch pointed out, most individuals think is a rather negative thing? But I want to challenge that notion today by having us briefly examine 3 things. First of all, what is really the nature of peer influences? And second of all, then, to think about the case of teen driving in terms of those characteristics of peer influence. And then finally, to think about how those results might suggest some strategies to promote positive peer influences. So let's turn first of all to that notion of the nature of peer influences. I think most individuals are aware that the general population thinks of peer influences, as Mitch said, in terms of this direct peer pressure. And we know that peer pressure is pure evil, and it should be combated, as many individuals have in titles such as these, Don't Give In to Peer Pressure, How to Say No and Still Keep Your Friends, and so on. That's our notion of peer influence and how we should deal with it. This deals back, I know, from the Reagan era and Nancy Reagan's notions of just saying no. But as Mitch has pointed out, we've learned a lot about peer influence that suggests that this may not be an accurate picture. First of all, peer influence is a reciprocal and transactional process. When one individual is being influenced by a peer, that individual's responses in turn are peer influences themselves. And we have to think of it in terms of those transactional processes. As Mitch pointed out, it comes from multiple sources, not just one's best friends, but individuals one wants to be best friends with. It's not necessarily an intentional process either. Young people will go to the store. Have you ever had this, taking your kid to the store to buy binders and notebooks, and you think the blue ones are really nice, and they say, not over my dead body? Not because they have any other peer there, but because they've seen the peers of most importance carry something else. And that indicates also that peer influence is cumulative. It occurs not just in one instance in a response to that instance, but accumulating over time. And finally, it comes in multiple forms, not just this direct peer pressure, but some of the more subtle indications that Mitch pointed to. When we look more carefully at studies of peer influence, we note that they come up with 3 things. The first of which I think is important to emphasize. Peer pressure is inevitable. If our effort is to eradicate peer pressure, we are going to be one frustrated monkey. It's not going to happen. Second of all, peer pressure can be a bad thing, but often is a good thing. And it is difficult, I think, many times for adults as well as adolescents to discern the difference between those two. And third, peer influence, I have come to believe, is best studied in context. The nature of the peer influences, the processes and their impact seem to differ from one context to the other. So given that, let us put ourselves within one particular context, looking at the case of teen driving. And I emphasize this context because of some things that we know. First of all, driving accidents are a leading cause of injury and death among teenagers. Driving accidents, not alcohol-related parties, not sexual activities, not so on and so forth, driving accidents are the leading cause of injury and death among teenagers. These accidents are most common in the early months since licensure, in the first 6 months in particular. And one intriguing thing on the basis of some work that Bruce Simons Morton will probably talk a little bit more about tomorrow is that having teen passengers in one's car increases the accident rates for young people. Just the opposite of what happens when one is older. Typically, adults drive better when they have people in the car. Teenagers, when they have peers at least in the car, drive worse. Why? What is it that prompts teenagers to behave in terms of greater health risk when we have adolescents in the vehicle? Well, to understand that, we have to get into the vehicle and see what's going on with passengers there. So we are beginning to engage in that enterprise. Now, to explore this notion of peer influences within the car among novice teen drivers, we figured, first of all, we need to identify what forms of influence occur. And then on the basis of that, see whether or not we could develop some measures of those influences to get a better understanding of when and how they occur and what their impact is. And then use those measures to procure some teen reports on influences. Now, I'm going to comment today here on some very basic early findings in our process to give you some sense of what we see. When we talk to teenagers and we survey the literature, we found a variety of different forms of peer influence on teen driving. The first of which is what we might call incitement, the old common peer pressure where individuals are really strongly encouraging a young person to do something that probably is going to be more dangerous in terms of driving. A second, perhaps what we think the most common form, is distraction. Calling individuals' attention to something going on outside the vehicle or somehow distracting them from the process of driving. And particularly when they are a novice driver, that's really dangerous to do. A third was disruption, meaning that they did something to actually disrupt the action of driving, whether it's pushing or shoving or covering the eyes or grabbing the steer wheel or all sorts of other fun things that teenagers can think about doing in a car when they're together. These are all what we might call health risk types of influences or negative influences, and there are more positive influences that we ought to point out as well. For example, some peers will criticize individuals who are driving dangerously and suggest that they cut out that particular behavior, and they may also praise or encourage safe driving. So we have a mix of both positive and negative kinds of peer influences that we understood, and all of those are what we might call proximal influences, in the sense that they occurred within the context of the car. But there are also distal influences that may not be immediately apparent when the teenager is driving, but could have an impact on the driving behavior. The first of those is what we might call peer talk, that there are conversations that relate in one way to driving and can, we're going to score it here in a negative direction, but could either encourage more positive driving behaviors or make it seem as if the norms within the peer group are towards more negative kinds of driving behaviors. And then teenagers who are not driving may witness other people driving, and that serves as a source for them to model. So when they see peers driving dangerously, that may be their sense of that's how they're supposed to drive, despite what mommy and daddy and their driver instructor have told them. These all five then, we tried to work into a particular exploratory study where we dealt with about 160 Midwestern teens, and you can see fairly evenly divided by gender, but primarily European American, who are in the early stages of driving. And to these, we gave a set of 41 items measuring the degree to which they experienced peer influences in driving, both proximal and distal influences. And then we measured their driving behavior, thinking about 3 particular areas. The first of those areas is what I'm going to refer to as problem driving, which is the degree to which, during this period of time, they have experienced accidents or near accidents, or perhaps even been pulled over by a police officer, or, God forbid, been given a ticket. The second of which is what we call dangerous driving, where they've sort of gotten away with things that perhaps were not terribly good driving, either when they were alone with no passengers in the car, or driving the same driving behaviors when they were with peers. And we developed an anonymous self-report survey where we gave these 41 items. But we asked them to report how often, when they were a driver, other passengers in the car engaged in these influences. And then we also asked them, because remember, it's a reciprocal process, how often, when their peer was a driver, they engaged in those same influences towards the individual, whether or not this is almost a personological characteristic. So let me quickly tell you a little bit about our findings. We took all these 41 items and put them into a factor analysis and came up with sort of what we expected, except that incitement and disruption, which we thought were going to be separate factors, combined into one particular factor. Distraction appeared as well. And then there was a set of items that dealt with aggression, verbal aggression or physical aggression, that somehow these teenagers felt went together as an influence, generally a negative influence. And then, of course, we had our 2 positive influences, as we expect, that sometimes peers will praise or caution individuals to behave appropriately. And then we had our criticisms of poor driving. Now, when we take a look at how those 5 influence factors, along with, remember, our 2 distal factors, were associated with these driving outcomes, here's very quickly kind of a review of those findings. The first thing that we did was to put in the behavior of the individual as an influencer, so that we thought perhaps this was going to be a characteristic that might color their driving, and they might just associate with peers who did the same sorts of things. And here, as we sort of expected, the negative influences did have an impact here. We actually combined those 3 negative influence factors, incitement, disruption, distraction, and aggression, into one, just because we need to save a little power in this thing. Then when, however, we added the peer influences, you'll see that self as passenger influences disappeared. We still have the negative influences on board. And adding the distal processes didn't do very much for us. We didn't explain very much of the variance, 11% of the variance in this sort of problem driving, but they didn't engage in a whole lot of problem driving. I guess I needed to give them a few more months to really screw up, and that didn't happen. When we take a look at the same kinds of analyses with regard to dangerous driving when they're driving alone, again, their own influences did make a difference here. Negative influences on their part, other teen drivers, was correlated with poor driving on their part as well. And the more they praised and cautioned other drivers, the less problematic they were. And once again, those disappear, and we see those negative influences popping out when we take a look at the peer influence patterns. And again, the distal process is not much different. What happens when we take a look at dangerous driving when we have passengers? Again, it appears as if their own behaviors are correlated with that. Again, they disappear. Ooh, something happened there. We lost our negative influences, and we picked up criticizing bad driving, and it actually was correlated with worse driving. That's kind of weird. And once again, our distal influences didn't do much. So what do these findings suggest? First of all, peer influences indeed are correlated with problem behavior. But the negative influences seem, in this case, to outweigh the positive influences. Moreover, criticizing bad driving doesn't help. I'm guessing because if your peers are criticizing your driving, you're probably doing some pretty bad driving. Remember, this is just a one-time study. Proximal influences are stronger than distal influences in this particular case. And peer influences on teens remain noticeable even when we control for teens' own capacity to influence their peers as drivers. Well, given that, what can we do? I'm going to suggest a AAA approach. Not because I'm being funded by them, but there is always hope. And that has to do with awareness, affiliation, and assessment. And by awareness, I mean one thing that I believe we can do with teenagers is to help them understand the forms and directions in which peer influence is manifest. And we've seen Mitch refer to a few indications that that might be the case in various intervention and prevention programs. I think it's worth our while as parents and educators to try to do a better job of that. I'm going to take a little bit of an issue with what Mitch said. I agree we can't select our child's friends, but we certainly can direct them to particular sources and encourage them to join peer groups likely to maintain constructive influences and minimize the more negative ones. I don't know whether or not you have had this experience. I guess I grew old as my kids became teenagers. I just forgot to give certain phone messages to them. People would call and I would just forget to write it down. I guess that happens when you get older. And finally, I think it's important to engage in a process of encouraging adolescents for greater assessment, to discern the trade-offs between the social enhancement that may accompany acceding to peer influences and self-destructiveness on the other hand. So it's not a matter of manipulating the peer influences as much as creating a greater awareness and attention. And let me just end by adding one thing. I wonder whether or not our driver education programs should also be passenger education programs. Teenagers affect each other in the vehicle, and we really haven't looked very carefully at that. In other words, adolescents need to understand how they influence, as well as how they are influenced by peers. And the challenge, I think, for our prevention and intervention programs is to make that a reciprocal, transactional process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brad. Our next talk is by Scott Gest. Comes to us from the Human Development Program at Penn State University. Scott's been working in the area of school-based prevention research. He has a history of numerous grants and intervention studies, ranging from studies seeking to improve the quality of Head Start programs to some of his current work on classroom peer ecologies in work that's sponsored by both the William T. Grant and Spencer Foundations. His talk today is on recognizing and enhancing positive peer influence processes.
Well, it's a real privilege to be here today, and I really enjoy the process of stepping back and trying to think from a more broad perspective how things that I've been working on with my colleagues kind of connect to some of our broader concerns, shared concerns with youth development. As Joe said, I've done most of my work in school-based peer relationships, which is a very particular social context, and mostly in the elementary and middle school years, a little bit younger than the kids that Mitch and Brad have often studied. So some of the nuances of the theories that have been more salient to me are a little bit different, but you'll see a lot of similarities, obviously, in how we think about these things. Okay. So as the broad backdrop that we're all working with here is that there's a tendency in popular culture, at least, to think about peer relationships as a context in which problems occur, bullying, victimization, delinquency, substance use, or as a source of negative influence towards bad individual behaviors. But as the premise of this whole panel that Joe constructed is built on, it's also possible to think about peers as a context in which important skills and values develop. And there's actually a long tradition within developmental psychology as a discipline that predates a lot of our current concerns with prevention and promotion, dating from the middle part of the 20th century when peer relationships were primarily studied as a source of positive developmental outcomes, dating back to the 30s with Piaget, who most people know of as a cognitive developmentalist, actually spent quite a bit of time talking about how peers have a unique role to play in both moral and cognitive development because of the unique nature of having interactions between equal status partners. And there's certain notions of justice and morality and fairness that only come from interacting with equals, where reaching an agreement on something, unlike with a parent, is more than just compliance. It's somehow balancing mutual needs. And further in the later parts of the century, where people were talking about the emotional and affective consequences of experiencing emotional support from peers. So there's a long tradition within developmental psychology of emphasizing the positive functions of peer relationships. But that became, I think, overrun maybe in the last 25 years with a heavy problem-oriented focus that was driven maybe partly by funding agencies, partly by justified concerns with some of the things that do occur in a peer context that were worth studying. But I guess what I'm going to try to do today is present two examples of work that I've been involved with, but I think that highlight broader themes of how to recognize and enhance the latter kinds of influences without ignoring or pretending that the kinds of concerns that people have had are just not there, because they are. So I'm going to do that by talking about some research on peer victimization and bullying and on adolescent substance use. And I chose these two in part because currently those are two problem areas where schools do perceive it to be their role to some degree. There seems to be currently broad consensus that schools have some role in both of those, in promoting solutions to both of those kinds of problems. So I think it's an area where if we can find an entree for more positive use of peer relations, that's one we could think about. I'm not going to go over this, spend much time at all on this, other than to say that both Mitch and Brad and I all had the same idea that we should mention something like this, which is that there are many different ways in which peers influence each other, going from the straight dyadic kinds of influence that both of them highlighted to broader notions of roles and reputations and norms that extend beyond what any of us can do in a single study. But it's a very complex social system when you start studying peer networks in a school setting. In the context of one of those studies, we did a 5-year longitudinal study where we followed 450 youth across their transition to middle school, and with support from a variety of agencies and some great graduate students over the years. And what I'm going to show you today is just one analysis that was actually Deborah Temkins took a lead role on this in looking at patterns of friendship and victimization across the first 2 years of middle school. So we surveyed kids the fall and spring of their 6th grade and 7th grade years. And we were interested in how friendship patterns were interrelated with victimization experiences. And so what Deborah had come to in reviewing the existing literature on that is that friendship was tied up in victimization and bullying in a couple of complicated ways. One strand of thinking is that if you have a friend, you're going to be protected against being bullied. Another point of view is that if you are friends with someone who's being bullied, then that's going to increase the chances that you're going to experience that subsequently. And then the third point, which is kind of a corollary of the second, is that maybe because of that, there's a tendency for kids to gravitate away from friends that they may have that are being bullied and picked on, right? And these have obvious implications for how you might think of intervening on behalf of kids who are bullied or in promoting friendships. Well, I'm not going to, with the spirit of the conference, I'm not going to go into any numerical results except to say that in two very different sorts of analyses, basically all three processes seem to be going on. So for example, kids who were friends with someone who was bullied in the fall but who themselves weren't, that affiliation increased, almost nearly doubled the chances that they would become victimized by the springtime in the eyes of their peers. So there was very clearly a cost to affiliating with kids who were victimized. There was also very clearly a cost to being socially isolated. Kids without reciprocated friends were much more likely to become victimized over time. The implications, just in a very simple-minded way, are that if you are trying to prevent this kind of negative behavior, friendship appears to be a really important social resource for kids to prevent emerging into that sort of role. But it's tricky because once that problem exists for a given child, if you could manufacture a friendship for that child and put that child in partnership with someone, you're putting that child at risk. Because there is an empirical association of becoming bullied when you are friends with someone. So it's not an easy social policy kind of picture to try to imagine how you'd fit this in, except to say that friendships clearly play an important functional role in both protecting from and protecting kids from the victimization experience. And so they have to be part of the discussion of a problem behavior requires us to bring in a whole large body of research on the supportive and positive functions of friendships. What we're trying to do in some of our current work is really look at a couple of things that would help teachers in schools learn to manage these kinds of dynamics a little more successfully. Part of the problem is that teachers are not terribly good at figuring out who's friends with each other, let alone who's bullying each other and picking on each other. So although most teachers that we've talked to, essentially all of them, see it as at least somewhat their role to keep track of these things, some of them are essentially giving us random names when we ask them about those kinds of dynamics. Others are really spot on. And we think it's going to be important to understand how it is that they come to understand the social dynamics of their classrooms and how that might be something that we could work with to learn which teachers are successful at spotting these kinds of dynamics and heading them off and which ones are not, and how to provide that kind of training to teachers. Just to give you a sense that it gets more complicated than what I've been implying here, is that we started, of course, with the intuitive assumption that bullying and friendship were occurring in different dyads. But of course, it doesn't always work that way. So this is a diagram of an elementary school classroom. Blue dots are boys and pink dots are girls. The size of the circles correspond to how many times a given child was named as a friend. So they have circles with more arrows going into them are kids who are named more frequently. And then conversely, the black lines correspond to friendship nominations directed from one child to another. The red lines we had to draw over top, those are the bullying dyads. So in this classroom, bullying and victimization is primarily a dynamic that sort of resides around the social periphery. You notice that most of the red lines are connecting kids who are very low in the number of friends that they have. In fact, the sort of sad situation of the girl, you can't even tell it's pink, towards the very center of the graph, see all sorts of lines connecting into that circle, but unfortunately all of them are going out. No one named her as a friend, but she named everybody in the class as her friend, because unfortunately that's a protective kind of dynamic a lot of kids get into when you ask them who your friends are. If they don't have any, they'll often just kind of circle all sorts of names. So that's pretty common. But in other classrooms, you find a very different dynamic. In this classroom, all of the bullying was really concentrated among some fairly average to high status boys and girls, some of whom named each other as friends as well, which is the trickier part yet. Seldom do they both name each other as friends, but often bullying occurs between kids where one names the other as a friend and it's not reciprocated. So this is just to say that it's very, very difficult to separate the positive, supportive functions of peer relations from the negative and harmful sorts that we might want to deal with. And I think we're kidding ourselves if we think we can just, as Rich Lerner pointed out this morning, you can't just talk about promoting positive relationships. You have to recognize and understand the negative features of relationships if you're wanting to really promote youth development. And I think these kinds of complex social dynamics are going to require some time to understand and then to help adults, responsible adults, play a constructive role. Okay. So second example, substance use prevention. I'm going to tell you some results from a very large-scale community randomized trial that was funded at both Penn State and Iowa State by some lead researchers. That I'm not a part of that team, but I am part of a smaller subgroup that got some funding to code the friendship networks in that study. It involves 11,000 youth and 54 community cohorts, followed 5 waves of data over 6th to 9th grade. This happened to be a study where there were 2 interventions that were done in the intervention communities. One in 6th grade that was a family-based intervention, evidence-based from prior research, another in 7th grade that was school-based. And the question that our group had was, how did those interventions impact the peer network? One way to think about that question is that peer networks, in a sense, at an individual level, kids have beliefs and attributions and norms or perceptions of what other kids value. But you can also gauge the norms in a given setting by what behaviors seem to be associated with getting a lot of friendship nominations. So in these 2 small network examples, there's a base rate, say if the red circle has a problem behavior, both networks have a problem behavior rate of 20%, 1 in 5. But on the left, you have the person who engages in problem behavior not being named as a friend by anyone and actually perceiving a more pro-social youth as a friend. In the subgroup at the right, you have the opposite pattern where everybody perceives the problem behavior kid as a friend, sort of implicitly valuing that behavior, and the problem behavior youth does not perceive those youth by and large as particularly desirable, right? So if I were going to ask you which of these networks would you be more concerned about over time in terms of the spread of problem behavior, presumably you'd be more concerned about the network on the right because people were looking to that problem behavior youth for influence. So what this suggested to us is that one way to think about how interventions might change a whole peer setting is by looking within each setting at the correlation between the problem behavior and how many times kids are named as friends, right? So we did this in each of these community networks, and then we're looking for differences before and after the intervention. This is the only data slide I'll show you. So the red rectangle circling the left far graph are the pretest scores, in which in the control classrooms, there was a stronger negative sanction against problem behavior. There was a negative correlation between problem behavior and friendship choice of negative 0.11. In the treatment group, it was less of a negative sanction. So that was before the interventions. After the interventions, the sort of little network patterns I showed you on the previous slide shifted so that in all waves of data collected after the interventions were delivered, the pattern was reversed, and youth in the intervention schools showed a somewhat more negative sanction against problem behaviors than in the control group. Notice that in some ways that we're working against the normal developmental pathway, which is as kids get older, there's less of a negative sanction against problem behavior, but we kind of held that in check more through the intervention process. So this was an instance in which interventions that were not really developed to be thought about at the setting level did seem to have some kind of cumulative impact on the social norms that existed within the schools. Okay, I didn't put a separate conclusion slide, but the inference that we drew was, the challenge is that, I left out the slide that I was going to mention briefly, that the interesting thing is that neither of these interventions, the child or the school-based or the family-based, really explicitly focused on any sort of positive peer influence. Most of those, the interesting thing about prevention programs in middle school for drug abuse prevention is that they do embrace the notion of individual positive development to a large degree. Many of them have curriculum components where they focus on individual self-control, self-regulation, goal setting, values, things that would fit comfortably in a positive youth development framework. But when they start to talk about matters of peers, they fall back into the sort of negative peer influence paradigm, so that all of the peer-related content in these programs tends to be how to say no, how to resist peer pressure. And as Connie and I were talking about before, and she's done some great work pointing in the direction of the possibility that much of the influence the peers have on each other, even in domains like substance use, is positive in terms of kids telling each other, hey, you might not want to do that, that's really going to mess up your lungs or whatever. But we don't try to capitalize on that or build on that in any way, which is odd because these programs otherwise do have some health promotion focus, but somehow in the interpersonal context, they've dropped that and just go with the old suppress peer influence kind of paradigm. So I think there's room there. I mean, the reason I'm somewhat optimistic about this direction for prevention programs is that there's already a foot in the door. Substance use prevention programs are widely accepted within schools. And within those programs, there's a broad acceptance of the notion that a short-term effective mode of instigating change is to promote positive individual development. So I don't think it's a big leap to start talking about incorporating some of the things that Connie could tell you more about in terms of how to instigate more positive peer influence processes. So broadly, what I take away from this in thinking about peer influence is that the challenge is to figure out how to work with adults who are in settings where these peer networks happen, and realize that currently adults are not very good at understanding youth networks. They don't really get these the peer culture on their own, and figuring out how to help them understand that better or give them tools to measure it better. But what many teachers and programs are already doing is they're improvising ways to intervene in those networks. Every elementary school teacher we talk to has strategies that when we asked her, what do you do when you have a child who's really isolated? They all listed strategies. None of them are based on anything they learned in teacher education or based on any evidence that exists, because there simply isn't any research on how teachers shape friendship patterns in classrooms. But there could be. We could do that work and try to help provide teachers with something beyond their best clinical judgment. We often frame peer influences negatively when we could expand more into the positive. And I think if we focus on ways to create a better developmental science that helps adults who are in these settings understand and respect the complexity of these network dynamics. And I think it's really not a productive direction to go to try to divorce the positive peer dynamics from the negative, because they're often, the negative dynamics, unfortunately, are often our entry points into the schools to work collaboratively around these issues, and they implicitly bring up the positive dynamics anyway. And I think we can capitalize on that and bring more of those into the school settings.
Thank you very much, Scott. Our final talk today is by Bonnie Leadbeater, who comes to us today from the University of Victoria, where she's a professor of psychology in the area of lifespan development. She is co-director of the British Columbia Child and Youth Health Research Network. She's also the lead evaluator for the WITS programs, a community university partnership to prevent peer victimization and bullying. And her talk today is on changing contexts and moving targets, assessing positive peer influences on mental health across developmental transitions.
Oh dear, I don't know if I can see that. Yes, it is an honor to be here. I sort of felt like I should reflect Connie's comments that she came to the meeting where someone else had invited all of her friends. So great job. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the issues of measurement in thinking about positive peer influences. And one of the reasons I think we have not done a good job at looking at these kinds of influences is because we don't really know how. And it's a big gap in our literature, and one that is really, I think, important that we think about. So the green button pushes us forward. When we look at quality of relationships or peer relationships, we know already that that peer relationships are associated with greater well-being, with lower levels of peer victimization, which you've heard, and with greater school engagement. We also know that for adolescents, positive peer influences affect psychological adjustment, school engagement, civic engagement, volunteering. You're more likely to volunteer if your friends are volunteering. They also alleviate emotional distress, can reduce substance use and delinquency, and do have effects on driving. Probably the most remarkable study I heard of in the driving effects, since we were on that topic, I'll try not to keep getting off topic, but was a group of peers who, if one person basically said, no, I'm not taking a drive with you because you've been drinking, the others also did not get in the car. So some real resources there for modeling behavior. When we're thinking about assessing positive peer influences right now, we seem to be still looking at friendship quality, reciprocated best friends, emotional support, social support, kind of broad measures, or sociometric status, the likability and your acceptance into your group. Or we think about this absence of association with negative peers. But it's actually very complicated, particularly in longitudinal studies, to follow peer relationships. They're broader than friendships, as you've heard. They change a lot, often over time, and they change depending on the context in which you're finding these friendships. And very small things can make a difference to your friends. So we know in elementary school, these annual classroom reorganizations can completely reconstruct your friendship network. School transitions from elementary to middle school give you a large, sometimes anonymous friendship network. Even shifting in your interest, giving up band for shop, joining a team, this can introduce you to a whole new bunch of friends. God forbid your family should move. Came from a military family. We were always readjusting our friends. Developmental transitions, and one that we've been studying quite a bit is this transition from adolescence to young adulthood, massive upheaval in terms of their friends. And of course, romantic relationships in this age group not only change themselves a lot, but also can change the relationships you have or then don't have with your friends as these relationships become more privatized. So I'm going to tell you about two studies where we're really trying to look at peer influences from a positive direction. One is a study of social competence and social responsibility in 1st to 3rd grade students, and the other is an attempt to measure positive peer activities in our longitudinal sample of the transition to young adulthood. So in this first study, we followed children in 1st to 3rd grade, and really we were interested in the mediating effects of individual and classroom levels of these variables of social competence and social responsibility, and how this affected peer relationships, or how this affected mental health and victimization over time. Now, we conceptualize peer relationships as sometimes personal capacities or sometimes characteristics of friends, but really to represent the interactive behavior is much more difficult. So when we think about social competence, we're really trying to represent how you and I interact with each other. If we're thinking of social responsibility, it's not my personal characteristic that I carry around in my pocket. You know, it's really what are we doing in these situations that others can see. So in this study, it's part of the WITS program evaluation sample. This is a program for kindergarten to grade 6, really directed at increasing social responsibility and decreasing peer victimization. We just got a grant to disseminate this in Canada, so if anybody wants to know about dissemination difficulties, you can talk to me, but if you have a place for it, we're looking for places. The class that we followed for these data are really time 1 and time 2. We didn't use the baseline data. So we measured physical and emotional victimization. We also looked at social responsibility. This is a teacher rating, a form of things teachers can see. What can you observe your kids doing? So is friendly and caring, helpful to others, helps with peer conflicts. This is something our teachers are required to rate. This is on the report card. It's part of our curriculum. So you can rate it from meets expectations to doesn't meet expectations, and that's the rating scale that teachers used. We also used the BAS, the Behavior Assessment for Children, to rate aggression, parent responses, and again, aggression and internalizing. And again, we asked parents to say, you know, what about social competence? Again, this is something you could observe. How well are you doing with friends? What are you doing in terms of social skills? Do you congratulate your friends? Are you good to other people? Do you have some leadership qualities? Do you get over this adaptability or self-regulation is also part of our ability to interact with others, and if we're losing it constantly, obviously we're not going to have a lot of luck with friendships. So we looked at how these things not only went on for individuals, but how did they go on in classrooms? Could we actually look at the context and measure these effects in the context? Again, if peer norms are making a difference, can we measure peer norms in children's classrooms? And it turns out this is really hard to do. They don't stay in the same class from one year to the next, so assessing peer norms requires you to do it in a very small group over a fairly short period. But in this particular instance, we looked at classroom levels of social competence and social responsibility as the average of everybody else in your class. So excluding your scores, on average, how does everyone else behave in terms of their social responsibility and social competence? And I definitely can't see this, but I hope you can. We did get effects when we looked at the individual measures, is what this is saying, but not the classroom measure. So in this case, social competence is mediating the effect of victimization on children's internalizing. If you're on children's depression and anxiety, if you're being chronically victimized, you're more likely to have mental health problems or behavioral health problems. If you yourself are being seen as socially competent, some leadership, some skills, then you will be less likely, if you're victimized, to have this relationship, probably indicating that you're being victimized less. Same effect for aggression. At the individual level, if you assess an individual's social responsibility as rated by their teachers, we did see an effect in alleviating this relationship between victimization and aggression. But the school level or the classroom level assessment of this was not working as a mediator. So children's social competence with a variety of peers did mediate the link between peer victimization and increases in mental health problems over time. And their socially responsible roles, the good things they're doing. This is good for kids, doing good things in your classroom, helping other kids in classrooms. That also was a protective factor in the relationship between victimization and internalizing and the victimization and aggression. So you can have a positive influence by, through training positive skills as the peer skills. Assessing classroom norms may require more class-level observation. We're going to get Bob Pianta up here and tell us how to do this. And some really annual renewal of a sample. It's very hard to do, but I think it's something we really need to start to get a handle on what's going on in terms of classroom norms. In the second study, we looked at positive peer influences in the transition to young adulthood. And again, this is a longitudinal design. We looked at peer support and positive and negative activities with peers and their relationship to anxiety symptoms. And we wanted to know whether initial levels and changes in peer support and peer activities predicted anxiety. So again, it's a longitudinal sample. We're currently collecting the fifth wave of data from what was 662 kids. This is a random sample of youth from the Greater Victoria area, and they were 12 to 18 when we started. We're still at 70%, and we're hoping to maintain that for the fifth wave. So you see these kids are transitioning across, although it's an accelerated cohort study, they are transitioning into young adulthood. So again, anxiety for peer support, peer emotional support, we used a standardized peer emotional support measure. Rely on my friends for emotional support. Pretty much anybody can find a friend who they think in this very broad way supports them. So although there's range on these kinds of measures, it's, I don't think, a great measure of how we relate to each other, how we engage with each other to measure emotional support. And we haven't found in most of these studies of using these data that there's been much of an effect for it, although you'll see a little one here. We also measured positive peer activities, and it's measured as a difference between the number of positive activities like playing sports, working hard at school, performing, church or spiritual groups, and negative activities, smoking, drinking, using drugs, gangs. Even in Victoria, we have gangs, and panhandling. And higher values indicate that you're involved in more positive activities. And in doing these analyses, we controlled for just the sheer number of activities that you were involved in. So anxiety goes up in this age group fairly dramatically, and particularly in girls. We saw a lot of increases in anxiety. The trajectories of peer support are pretty flat, not much change. You report the same kinds of peer support. The level you report when you are in 12 to 18-year-old groups stays pretty steady all the way across. Trajectories of peer activities were interesting. The opportunities, I think, for positive peer activities actually, you see in the green part, are going down, where the opportunities for negative activities are going up over this age group. I think putting drinking and smoking probably into that negative peer activity measure does push those upward in this age group. So what happened, you don't have to be overwhelmed by this slide. The main points are way on the left there, where it says the amount of social support that you have when you come into the to adolescence is pretty much related to your level of anxiety that you have when you come into adolescence. So that kind of stays the same. That's what we saw in those pictures. On the other hand, and that's particularly for girls, on the other hand, the level of positive activity that you're involved in as an adolescent actually shows, the level of positive activities that you're involved in actually shows increases or shows a favorable effect on dampening these increases in anxiety. So it was protective. To be in more positive relationships was protective. So conclusions, social support, interactions matter, social support is stable, but opportunities for positive peer activities may, although they decline and negative activities increase, higher levels of positive peer activities predicted declines in anxiety. So there's mental health benefits to this positive health, positive promotion stuff. Can we measure positive peer influences over time? Peer and romantic relationships change frequently, very systematically with context changes. Assessing their effects is going to challenge us all, and really understanding how to do that is going to challenge us all. Thinking forward, how can we tap positive peer interactions across these developmental stages, changing context? How can we improve opportunities for positive peer interactions at each developmental stage and across these transitions? I think we can create opportunities for positive peer interactions in schools, that we can do a lot in terms of pulling on socially responsible activities. We can also, through, I think, these youth development, positive youth development initiatives, really the behavior in some way will lead will lead kids to less negative behaviors and better mental and physical health. So.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. And now we're at the point where we actually have some time to begin to integrate this. We've seen a remarkable range of very thoughtful presentations about different options and avenues by which we can think about improving peer processes in adolescence, ways in which improving those processes can lead to positive outcomes. And now it's to the panel and to the audience to really think about how to begin integrating those a bit, and look forward to seeing what your questions are. And just a reminder, we ask you just to come up to the microphone to ask your question. Bart.
Hi, I'm Bart Hirsch, Northwestern University. I've been studying peer relations. This hasn't been my major focus, but something I've done from when I was a postdoc on. And I think a lot of the issues that you have been studying come up and are very important in the larger school context and in particular classrooms. I agree with Brad, it depends on the context. Now, the last 15 years or so, I've been looking at positive youth development-oriented youth programs, after-school programs. A number of years studying boys and girls clubs, mostly for middle school, early adolescence, and then more recently, a lot of apprenticeship-oriented programs for high schools, very similar to the kind of stuff that Reed Larson looks at. When you look at those programs, most of what you're talking about really isn't an issue. It's not a problem. You would not want to come in as an assistant professor with this as your research program. You wouldn't get tenure. You wouldn't come up with anything interesting. There are different issues, and what are some of the major sort of conditions that make these environments different? Well, one, there are adults there. That plays a major role. Mostly what you're talking about are relationships that do not have adult involvement or supervision or access to that. Two, these environments, at least the ones I've studied, have been in really low-income urban communities. These are places where you really can't go outside. You know, the parks are dominated by gangs and drug dealers. If you hang out with a bunch of your friends on the street, you could easily be shot. This happens often. So one of the places that kids do have access to for peers is they go to these after-school programs. And if they go to the Boys and Girls Clubs, there's not really a lot of stuff going on that are negative influences. It's not entirely free. There is a little victimization. Some clubs occasionally get dominated by gang people and they have to throw them all out. but mostly they're not. It's mostly a place where most kids come, on average 4 days a week, hours each day. The huge majority say it's like a second home to them. The apprenticeship programs is more like colleagues that you're getting involved in learning how to work, learning to develop soft skills. And Rich, I don't know where Rich is. Rich, you there? I think it's a really useful term to use in the business community. We can talk about that. But very different issues come up. One of the things is, and this isn't particular just to these clubs, but it is for this group of young people, is there's a really strong difference between what they refer to as an associate and what they refer to as a friend. And many of them have lots of associates but very few friends. And it really would be an interesting factor to see what kind of environments in after-school programs and what specialized programs within these broader environments facilitate associates turning into friends, because that's a real important thing. What happens to the emotional intimacy that goes on? Whether there's a greater tendency to develop some self-regulation when confrontations occur. Confrontations do occur. There are tons of physically active kids there. But the staff there are really savvy and street smart in knowing how to deal with that. So they keep things under control, and that's a different environment in terms of knowing that there's that safety net that's there, rather than having to sort of take out knives or guns or deal with whatever goes on. So I think one issue becomes then, long ago I published a study with one of my students in applied developmental science, looking at what friendships are like within some specialized programs. Like there's a program called Smart Girls for early adolescent girls and boys and girls clubs. And we looked at how did relationships develop in that particular program, and to what extent were they sustained then in the general environment, and to what extent did girls report that those peers in those programs were some of their closest friends when they drew overall maps of their social networks. And then if you look at the apprenticeship program, how do they learn to function together as a team when there's time pressure? When some of them take supervisory or leadership roles, how does that get transacted? And what effect does that have on the friendship component? So I think while the questions that you posed have been very important historically, they have been dependent largely on the settings that you have looked at. If you look at positive youth development-oriented programs, I don't think you'd want to study those questions. They're not really problems for the most part. I think peers are very important, but a whole different set of issues arise.
Just a couple quick reactions. I think you're right, spot on. But do you remember, of course, that not all after-school programs work that way? Okan Statin's work, for example, Joe Mahoney's work suggesting that sometimes after-school programs are wonderful fodder for planning all sorts of mischievous behavior. But that's because, I'm guessing, or they're guessing, the adults are sort of friendly and laid back.
They were very uninvolved.
Right. So that, I think, is a particularly important issue. And then you bring up a second issue as well, and that is options and alternatives. That in the lives of these young people that you're describing, life is dangerous outside of these environments, so it really is a godsend for them in some respects. And that just speaks, I think, to the issue of being very attentive to the context in thinking about how we take programs to scale. So that what may work in one context may not be very effective in another context. We have to really be very attentive to those contextual variables.
I also think what you're saying is interesting from the perspective of why isn't that what they're seeing in school? Why isn't it they're seeing an involved adult who's able to create a safe situation in a classroom or in a middle school? Why is this only an after-school kind of activity? Why aren't they seeing internships? We do know and have great information about how to do this right, but we keep doing it the wrong way.
Just briefly add, there has been some research talking about iatrogenic effects of even group therapy paradigms where there's not only adult presence and involvement, but a lot of structure by adults in a peer context, and simply aggregating peers together who might have experiences of engaging in deviant behavior does in fact seem to relate to a number of negative outcomes. So I think that what you raise is a really critical issue, because it's not just the context, but it's also what exactly are adults doing within that context, and what are peers doing? How supervised is it, and what implicit processes might be occurring that's actually promoting negative peer influence or negative effects, and what things might be happening that can promote positive effects. So not all programs that are designed to foster that positive development work as intended. Some of them actually do seem to backfire. It's important that we understand what those factors are so we can prevent them. And that's what some research has been recently looking at, is to understand exactly what type of adult interaction would help to mitigate those effects, and more specifically, what type of peer interaction is seeming to take what should look on the surface as being a very good, structured, adult supervised context, but actually it seems to predict negative outcomes long term.
Yeah, that stuff is really fascinating research. I'm aware of it. The difference mainly is that they're very different kids. Those that you're talking about, they sort of have a whole history of problem behavior, and you're bringing them all together. There are definitely some kids in these settings who have, some of them are involved with gangs, but they don't cluster together. They're sort of diluted by being spread out among the masses, and they're not brought together for any specialized intervention where an adult would have trouble controlling it and directing it to positive aims.
Yeah, I'm Brian Mustansky from Northwestern University. I thought this was a really fantastic panel. The area where I work is primarily HIV prevention with adolescents, and one of the ways in which some of the things that you've been talking about are particularly relevant is we have some interventions that have been, in fact, disseminated that use a popular opinion leader approach to do HIV prevention. But they aren't necessarily informed by some of the network type phenomenon that you've been talking about. And while you were presenting, I was thinking a lot about how you talked about targeting based on network position, that you might want to target networks in which the risk takers are more central to the network versus more on the periphery of the network, or even perhaps tailoring message based on social status, that the different type of message, particularly a peer norm type message, may change depending on the social position of someone. But in my limited experience doing some network work, it's quite resource intensive to collect this kind of network data, or to even firmly grasp someone's social position. And so if you were gonna perhaps think about using that data to do targeting or tailoring, you'd be making a huge investment in your assessment before you started delivering the intervention. And I wonder if you could grapple with that a little bit, or perhaps talk about if indeed we have any examples where people have done that successfully and shown that that collection of that very resource-intensive data is money well spent in terms of targeting or tailoring and improving intervention effectiveness. Hard question, I know. So.
Well, the only work that I'm aware of that's really experimentally tested that I'm sure you're aware of is Tom Valente's work, where, they implemented the same drug abuse prevention program under 3 different scenarios, each with peer leaders, but one of which was peer leaders who were chosen by peers as being classmates who they personally found believed to be good opinion, people that they would look up to, basically. And in the short term, the effects seem to be stronger of the same content program, just delivered through those sort of network-based peer leaders. But in a longer-term follow-up they did, those effects had washed out. And so I'm not sure, Tom may be aware of some more recent trials with that. Frankly, I share some of your caution about the efficiency of that kind of approach, because it's not clear that, at least with our tools now, it is very labor-intensive to gather that kind of data, because essentially what you have to do, say in a high school, is survey all the kids in the school about who they perceive a peer leader to be, and then in the optimal condition, match each kid up so that they get the program delivered to them by someone who's relatively more respected by them. And that's expensive in terms of time and resources. It's probably going to become less so over time as we automate how we can do that kind of thing. So it's very feasible to envision a web-based quick survey that could be done, and with enough behind-the-scenes software work, it could all be fairly automated. But I'm not sure the experimental evidence is there right now that the incremental efficacy is high enough to justify that over other ways that you could take that money and just saturate more message.
Yeah, I would also agree that I wouldn't use my money that way. I mean, I think those networks are also short-lived and turn over at a fair pace, so it's not going to be as useful. I think the problem with relying on popular and leaders and these kind of things is that part of what creates them is lack of opportunity. So if you have opportunities for youth action, for youth development, that aren't going to just pull out one or two people, but that are really going to tap the range of people's abilities and foster an atmosphere in which you can get everybody doing something. It doesn't have to all be the same AIDS prevention work, but that people can perform, or they can, clean up the schoolyard or plant a garden. Or I think one of the things that Joe and I did very early with Larry Aber around youth action projects. I mean, these kids were from the street, came in and created a project, said what they felt they most wanted to do. And, they cleaned up subways, and another group had a military group that marched around Central Park. I mean, it didn't seem to matter, but the idea that they organized it themselves and they had an opportunity to work with a facilitator who could help them make it happen. Dorothy Stoneman, again, amazing woman who helped kids organize New York City into a youth-built project. They renovated brownstones. I mean, the stuff these kids could do was phenomenal, but it's not, these characteristics are not in kids. They're in what we offer them. They're in our context. They're in our environment.
I wanted to, I think you've made a fairly convincing case for there's not much action in positive youth development in peer groups and trying to affect through peer processes. And I know you've done it primarily in We Don't Know Anything. We're still looking at this. We're still trying to develop the field. But I also know that there's a number of studies out there that do show this asymmetrical influence. There's negative influence is there, but you can't show the positive influence. So I'd be interested in hearing comments about perhaps maybe kids have friends, and it's important to make that a part of interventions you might use to positive youth development, but it may not be that peer processes are where there is a positive youth development opportunity. And if I'm wrong, if that's not what you meant or whatever, tell us about where you think there might be good research to do or action that could take place that might be through peer processes.
Just a gut reaction. The first thing that occurs to me is that friends don't let friends drive drunk. And that was essentially, I think, an adult-initiated campaign to change the nature of peer norms, to alter adolescents' driving behavior. So it's possible to do, but challenging, I think, to derive an intervention strategy that seems acceptable to peers, that doesn't seem to be invasive on the part of adults. Now, I don't know where to go other than to look at the limited number of success stories that we've had there to see whether or not there are critical characteristics that make a difference. When you convince them that life and death, or at least my ability to drive this vehicle that my parents own, is on the line, then it's a more compelling story. But that would be one place to start that suggests that we don't want to write peer processes out of the equation quite yet.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of positive peer influences out there that people just haven't asked about yet. I think that particularly as kids are moving on to college applications, for instance, there's a lot of ways in which kids are getting most of their information from peers at that point. They're learning about activities they should be involved in. They're learning about the ways in which they'll be evaluated by others. And although parents and guidance counselors are helpful in that process, a lot of the most current information and a lot of the access to information is coming from peers. Simply one example, but I do think there are many examples in which peers are helping to promote the very things that were discussed this morning, but it isn't very often looked at. I think that adolescents are also very good at sniffing out when there is a movement towards a positive development outcome that is adult-driven with a peer spokesperson, versus something that's truly a peer norm that's being communicated. And I think what's very important is to try and understand, although I do think there are exceptions like the one that Brad's mentioning, I do think that adolescents are very good at sniffing out the difference between those and measuring the ways that peers can facilitate adherence to an adult prescribed value is going to be very different from understanding how peers are helping to move one another towards things that they have derived themselves and that they care about. So I think with some nuance to the question, there's a lot that needs to be done.
I would just, only thought I would add is I hope that was not an impression that I would have left, because I actually think that, yeah, there's a lot of normative friendship literature that makes that very point, that actually most friendship influence is positive, both in terms of self-concept, but also behaviors like achievement. There's a good bit of research that shows kids influence each other's in positive ways in their achievement behaviors and engagement. And I also think it's just completely understudied in the prevention context, and Rico and others who've worked on developing some of these programs may know better, but I'm not familiar with studies that have tried and failed to get kids to influence each other to be more, that tried to promote health promotion messages around substance use among peers. Most of it's been refusal skill oriented. And I'm not sure that it's because they've tried and failed to do other kinds of positive influence, but I just don't know that it's been done.
Yeah, I agree. That's a huge measurement issue. And, whether we run them as a horse race in our studies or whether we sort of independently try to tease out more about positive influences, I think they're different approaches. We already know that the negative influences will win the race if we race them against each other.
Question?
Hi, I'm Deb Tolman, Hunter College in the Graduate Center, and my thoughts are inchoate, and I'm a little bit out of my element here, so a little associative logic for a minute. So Brad, when you made the comment about not giving messages to your kids, I have 2 teenage sons myself, and I thought they get all their calls on their cell phones. I have nothing to do with it. I couldn't possibly not give a message because I'm so not a part of those communications, which then made me think about the place where friendship is happening for our kids more importantly now than before. And we talked about school and we talked about after school, but we have not talked about the world of online, which is where our kids are having a lot of their friendships. And I think a lot of peer influence or shaping, or however we want to talk about it, is likely happening. I'm struck, in part because they have so much homework that they don't necessarily have time to physically spend with their friends, that to manage and to engage in friendships, a lot of it is really happening online. And I'm wondering how we're not going to get lost in our research to the salient dimension of young people's lives, and if you've thought about at all how to incorporate or even what we should be asking about the world of online friends, real and maybe not so real.
We've actually done some work on that, and what we found is that the online relationships are really an extension of what we've seen over the years offline, that we find continuities from age 13 to age 20. You can watch 13-year-olds with their friends interacting. You can predict what they're going to be doing by age 20 in their online friendships. I think, so it's not some whole new scary world. What's most noteworthy about it, though, is that as adults, we have, unlike Brad, we have no input into it. And I think to that extent, if we're trying to influence peer group norms in a larger way, we tie our hands behind our back if we say that we're going to do it without, as adults, getting involved with young people in a way that gives them some autonomy, some control, but some options to do things that they want to do. And then we start to have influence. Otherwise, we're just trying to take this process of socialization, which is very powerful, and hope that it goes well, throwing a little message in every now and then, like a little pop-up window, and that's not going to do it.
Well, just to quickly respond, first of all, I guess I'm old. So I'm talking about our oldest who didn't have a cell phone at the time. But I understand what you're saying, but I really do reaffirm what Joe is talking about. I don't think that we should feel as if the electronic world has incapacitated parents from having some impact on the friendships of their children, because they really are, the online interactions are an extension, by and large, of offline relationships. To the extent that we can direct individuals in our kids in constructive ways, they're going to find constructive friends. And yes, there are an enormous number of secrets that we don't know about, but then again, in my house, the telephone cord for our one telephone was long enough to reach into the closet where I could close the door, and I'm not sure how much my parents knew. And on the other hand, I know an awful lot of parents who tell me an awful lot of things about the text messages that their children send, that they monitor, perhaps without the teenagers recognizing it.
If that's the case, then should we be looking at doing research in this arena at all, or should we stick with thinking these are, and I think that's makes a lot of sense, and I've seen that research too, that if we're seeing extensions of what's happening in their embodied lives happening online, should we be just focusing in that way? Or how do we resolve what to do about this reality of young people's lives from a research perspective?
You know, I think the online relationships, you know, not only are large enough that we ought to be looking at them because a lot happens there, they offer opportunities. So we were able to get young people to give us permission to access their Facebook pages. And at that point, you've actually got a picture of real time, real interaction that is relatively unfiltered. I don't think certainly their friends were not, you know, filtering in terms of what they were doing. How else can you get that with adolescents? So I think, and Brad's point about text messages is probably true as well. There are opportunities here, and not just kind of costs and frightening new worlds. Bruce.
Bruce Simons Morton, NICHD. So I'm wondering if we can't think about peer influence. And there's tremendous amount of data that show that behaviors of adolescents and their peer group are similar. So among early adolescents or pre-adolescents, you know, nobody smokes, nobody drinks. They all have very negative attitudes towards these things. But as you get exposed and you find out about these things from your friends, you begin to, you're more likely to smoke. In fact, the longer you go, the older you are before you report you have a friend who smokes, the less likely you are to smoke. So whether this is a socialization or a selection factor, or whether it is largely an exposure factor. Once you have a friend who smokes, cigarettes are available to you much more so, and certainly that's true for marijuana and other things. But moving to an area I actually know something about, driving, there seems to be some similarities here, although they may be very, very contextual. So there have been half a dozen good studies of the fatal accident reporting system looking at the effects of passengers on drivers, fatal crash rates of drivers of various ages. And what we know from that is that among adults, having passengers in the car is protective. You're less likely to have a fatal crash because there's another adult in the car, probably because your spouse is telling you to slow down or is co-driving or whatever. However, when there's a teenager in the car, people at every age, but particularly teenage drivers, are at highly elevated risk of a fatal crash. So the single biggest factor here is having a teen driver and a teenage passenger, and it's a little bit higher for males than for females. And of course, fatal crashes, thank God, are rare, but they're also strange. They tend to be very unusual, very contextual. They tend to involve high speeds, late at night, often multiple passengers. They tend to be run off the road kind of crashes, compared to non-fatal crashes, where the literature on the effects of teen passengers gets strange. Some studies show that there's a risk. Some studies shows that there's actually a protective factor of having a teen passenger in the car. So what is it that is going on? What is it about? Probably they're both positive and negative factors, but they seem to operate under certain contexts.
We did a study of rural and urban kids who were drinking and driving and also riding with others who drink and drive, since a third of the kids who die in these traffic accidents are passengers in the car, not drivers. But the moderating effect, of course, the peer influence was there, but the moderating effect was what the parent did. If you'd driven in a car, or the adults, if you had driven in a car with an adult who had been drinking, you were much more likely to do it if your peer was going to do it. So I think, I think Patricia Shope, is her name, says we start learning to drive when we first sit in the car with that little, car seat and seatbelt on, and what your parents are doing is 16 years of teaching you to drive. You don't start to drive when you get your learner's permit. What is going on? If you want to talk about context, what is going on, in the driving context where you've spent the first 16 years of your life?
Not sure I agree, but it's certainly a worthwhile point to argue. Mostly teenagers don't know anything about driving until they start driving. They probably are influenced by previous experiences, but whether it's observing parents driving or whether there's something else going on, I don't really think is known.
You don't think if your parent was drinking and driving or speeding that you would be thinking that might be okay?
Clearly.
You don't learn all your norms from your parents.
Yeah, you do get you don't get all your norms from your parents, but you do get norms from your parents, and you get norms from your peers, and you get norms from those, whatever those experiences are. So,
Yeah, Bruce, I think the larger lesson that you point us to, again, is trying to understand the dynamics, the peer dynamics that are occurring within any social context. And the driving situation is unusual in that adults are very distal in that process. They're around in other vehicles and sort of remember that they're at home, but they're not immediately present. And as I think of some of the other things that we've talked about in classrooms, in after-school programs, as Bart mentioned, and so on, you have different levels of adult involvement and adult direction and adult modeling behaviors that really seem to have an impact. So that generally speaking, just beyond the driving situation, this is an area that we need to really carefully concentrate on. How do the peer influences processes work in therapy groups, where there are these bizarre iatrogenic effects that we wouldn't expect, in carefully monitored situations and unmonitored situations. But unfortunately, I think we're coming to consensus here. It's pretty virgin territory for research, and therefore it's hard to know how to translate that into practice.
I think we have time for one last question, Connie.
I'll try to be fair. Okay. Connie Flanagan, University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm only going to say this because Patrick raised the question and Scott mentioned our studies. All of us aren't virgins, I was going to say, respect to it. So when I was at Penn State, we actually did a longitudinal study that NIDA funded. I tried to call it prevention as a civic issue, which they didn't like, but it was basically, is there such a thing as socially responsible prevention? Now, so it was kids' attitudes towards intervening, okay? The first thing I'll say is that the first set of reviews we got back from the panel, one of the reviews said kids don't do this, and I had to resubmit it saying, with all due respect, I can't find any research figuring out whether they do or don't. So, I mean, it was actually converting our peers to actually imagine that. That was the first hurdle. Then what we found was, so this is really not so much behavior. We had a few behavioral indicators. A lot of it was just attitudes. Would you do something if suppose your friends were doing this? How likely is it that you would do the following things? And we followed them for 3 years, and we did find developmental patterns. And it was kind of curvilinear. So kids in 5th and 6th grade were highly likely to say, I'd do anything to save my friends, right? I'd do anything. They didn't have a great repertoire of what they do. So I think the skills, like, just say no has been, get away from friends and just say no has been sort of the norm of what we've done. So we haven't done a very good job of what would you do if your friends were doing such and such. But they wanted to. The older kids, actually, by the end of adolescence, also for different reasons. Okay, so they actually sort of saw the public implications of these risks. So it wasn't just I should intervene because that's what friends do, but other people get hurt when we don't do anything, right? So it was, to use Bonnie's phrase, socially responsible intervention is actually a way we should think about this. In the middle school years, there was a lot of, I'd be too embarrassed, it wouldn't do any good, a lot of myths around, probably what all of you in the peer network know about kids in development around peer relationships. So there was this curvilinear sort of trend. It was also the case, however, that factors mattered. So if your families taught you values of social responsibility, you were much more likely to say, I'd do something about it, right? If you felt a sense of solidarity or inclusion in your schools, you were far more likely to say, I'd intervene with a peer, regardless of age, okay? So, and if you felt like a kid who was excluded, that you didn't belong, you had a great sense of loyalty to friends, but you'd never rat on them. You'd never actually do anything. And a huge thing that we didn't expect to find was that there was a big fear that if you went to an adult in a position because you were worried about a friend, not only would they get in more trouble, you would get in trouble as well, just by association. So there was a great deal of mistrust of people in authority, particularly in schools, about using them as allies in prevention altogether. So, I think there's a huge possibility out there, and we actually have some basic evidence that you could do this, but there are a lot of hurdles because we have this image of kids don't do this stuff, and what they do is pretty negative. So I think there's a lot of room for people to sort of work at doing this kind of stuff.
So I think that the key question seems to be, is there real money, so to speak, in trying to think about how peer processes can be used to be positive influences on kids towards okayness or thriving or something, versus there are things we can do to kids that are about how they're affected by their peers. I think that's where I hear some distinction that's worth really trying to think about, because the part I also heard in this, and this is, I'm not purposely being difficult about this, but I just keep hearing this, is there's something about working with the family and the adults in managing the kids is where the action is. The action is not in the peers changing the way they influence each other, or that norm shifting is easy to do or anything like that. It's having adults present, being interactive and engaged. And if that's the case, that would suggest a lot of things we could do, but it might also suggest an area that isn't as promising. I suspect the answer is exactly what you said. We just don't have enough information yet to know, and we need to do. That might be a very good reason to do the work.
Patrick, we'll give you the last word in the interest of having some break time where we can interact with our peers. I want to thank the panel. And also, just to let you know, we'll have about 15 minutes for break time. After that, we'll come back with Joanna Lee Williams moderating our next panel on youth as engaged citizens.